He was the name the whole south side of Chicago lowered its voice to speak. She was just a waitress with trembling hands and a debt she could never repay. But that night, in a candlelit restaurant, as she leaned down to pour wine for the most dangerous man in the city, she whispered the three most desperate words of her life. "Please help me." Grayson Donovan had heard 1,000 pleas from men who owed him money, men who betrayed him, men begging to keep breathing. None of them had ever moved him. Yet 3 words from this stranger touched something he thought he had buried long ago. A memory from 18 years past. A debt so deep that even his entire empire could never repay it. She had no idea who she had just asked for help, and he didn't yet know that saving her would mean saving the last human part of himself. If you've ever believed that no act of kindness, however small, is ever truly lost, then stay with this story until the very end, because it will make you believe it forever. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories that touch the heart like this one. Leave a like if you believe that kindness always finds its way back. And share this story with someone you're grateful for. Now, let the story begin. Ember Room sat on the top floor of a historic building in the heart of Chicago, where every table was spaced far enough apart that no one could overhear anyone else's conversation, and that was exactly why men like Boyd Mercer chose the place. At 8:45 on Friday night, the elevator doors slid open, and Grayson Donovan stepped inside. No one announced him. No one had to. The restaurant manager straightened his back just a little more. The 2 men in black suits standing near the kitchen entrance subtly shifted their stance, and the conversations at the tables nearest the aisle suddenly dropped by half a tone, as though the entire room had taken the same silent breath. Gray didn't look at anyone. He walked straight to the corner table, where Boyd Mercer sat, waiting with the smile of a man who'd already calculated the price of everything in the room, including the price of the man now taking the seat across from him. Grayson. Mercer's voice was warm and smooth, like wine served at exactly the right temperature. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know you don't enjoy dinners like this." Gray pulled out his chair, sat down, and rested both hands on the table. "I don't like wasting time," he said. "You've got 30 minutes. The waitress appeared beside them, almost without a sound. A young woman with brown hair neatly tied behind her neck, wearing a crisp black uniform with a small name tag that read Tessa. She poured the water, placed the menus on the table, and did everything in perfect order, with the precision of someone who'd spent enough years in the job that her hands already knew every movement on their own. But Gray noticed immediately what 15 years of living on the edge between life and death had trained him to notice. Her hands were trembling, only slightly, just enough to send a tiny ripple across the surface of the water in the glass. But they were trembling. He noticed things like that. Old habits don't fade easily. And there was something else. A faint bruise on her left wrist had already turned the pale yellow color of an injury several days old, something the sleeve of her uniform couldn't completely hide whenever she leaned forward to pour water. Her eyes weren't fixed politely on the table the way well-trained servers usually kept them. Instead, they occasionally darted toward the kitchen entrance where Mercer's 2 men were standing, then instantly dropped again, like someone who'd accidentally touched a blazing hot stove. Gray took in every detail in less than 3 seconds, then stored it away in that quiet corner of his mind, where he kept facts he didn't yet know how to use. Mercer began talking about boundaries. He spoke in the polished language of businessmen, using words like partnership, vision, and shared interests. But beneath that velvet covering, a blade was being laid across the table inch by inch. "The Southern Harbor," Mercer said as he slowly swirled his wine, "has been operating below capacity. My people can make things move much more smoothly there. All you have to do is not look in that direction for a few nights every month." Gray didn't answer right away. He looked at Mercer the way a chess player studied a board, not focusing on the piece that was moving, but on the 3 moves waiting behind it. "It's my harbor," Gray said, his voice no louder than the distant piano music drifting through the room, "and whatever passes through it follows my rules. You know those rules. The whole city knows those rules." Mercer smiled, the smile of a man hearing exactly the answer he'd expected, but still wanting to hear it with his own ears. "Rules." He repeated the word as though tasting an unfamiliar dish. "Rules are a luxury reserved for people who've never been backed into a corner, Grayson." Meanwhile, more than 20 steps away from that table, Tessa Monroe carried a tray of appetizers past the waiting area, where several of Mercer's men were passing the time with glasses of whiskey they hadn't paid for. She had no intention of listening. She only wanted to get past them as quickly as possible, deliver the food, return to the service station, and survive tonight's shift. But just as she walked by, One of the men lowered his voice and spoke to the man beside him, with the casual confidence of someone who believed waitresses were nothing more than furniture that happened to walk. Donovan blocked the shipping route through the harbor again last week. The old man's never had anything to do with human trafficking. The boss is running out of patience. Just one sentence. Tessa didn't slow her pace. She didn't turn her head. Her expression didn't change. She'd learned long ago that in places like this, whatever your ears heard, your face couldn't let the world know it had heard anything at all. But inside her chest, something shifted. She set the tray down on the table, excused herself in the same steady voice, and during the short walk back to the service station, her mind worked faster than it had at any moment in all 26 years of her life. The man sitting with Mercer in the corner wasn't Mercer's friend. They were two wolves growling at each other across a white tablecloth. And the wolf named Donovan, the man whose name made the entire South Side lower their voices, the man everyone claimed didn't have a heart, turned out to possess something Boyd Mercer didn't, a line he would never cross, one thing he would never do, no matter if the price was war itself. Tessa stood behind the service counter, looked down at her hands, and realized they'd stopped trembling, not because she wasn't afraid anymore. She was still terrified enough to hear the pounding of her own heartbeat inside her ears. She still knew perfectly well that the two men near the kitchen entrance glanced toward her from time to time, the way people watched over merchandise that had already been wrapped and was simply waiting for delivery. But because inside her mind, an idea had just taken shape, one so reckless it bordered on madness, and so mad that it might be the only road to survival she had left. She looked toward the corner table, where the most dangerous man in the city was sitting, and began counting how many minutes remained until the next round of wine was poured. The next round of wine service was 12 minutes away, and during those 12 minutes, Tessa polished glasses behind the service counter with calm, steady hands while her memory pulled her back to the previous Tuesday afternoon, the afternoon that had driven her to the edge of this abyss. That day she had been summoned to the restaurant's office on the 3rd floor, where Boyd Mercer sat behind a broad wooden desk to sign the renewal papers for her debt, the debt from her mother's medical bills that had spent 3 years accumulating interest upon interest, like a pit digging itself deeper every single month. She'd signed papers like that so many times she knew the feeling by heart, the feeling of writing her own name onto something that would never truly end. But that afternoon, halfway through the signing, Mercer's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, stood up, stepped into the hallway, and left the office door partly open behind him. On the desk beside her stack of loan papers, a black notebook still lay open. Tessa hadn't meant to look. She'd lived long enough in the world of men like Mercer to understand that in their world, the less you knew, the longer you lived. But her eyes drifted across the page the way eyes sometimes drift without permission, and then she saw a name that made it impossible to look away. Reyes. Manager Reyes, the gray-haired man who always set aside a box of leftover food for her at the end of every shift, the man who'd quietly told her 2 months earlier that some of the numbers inside the restaurant didn't add up, and that he intended to find out why. The man who'd simply failed to come to work one Monday morning, leaving the staff with nothing but the explanation that he'd resigned without warning and moved to another state. Inside the black notebook, his name had been crossed out with one clean, straight line of red ink, and beside it was a date. The very same Monday. Tessa could still hear Mercer speaking evenly into his phone in the hallway, and during the next 30 seconds, she'd done the most reckless thing she'd ever done in her life. She slipped out her phone, photographed the open page, quickly turned another 5 pages, photographed those as well, the columns of numbers, the company names, the handwritten notes filling the margins, then placed the notebook back in exactly the same position, at exactly the same angle, and sat upright again in her chair 2 seconds before the office door opened. Mercer came back inside, finished signing the papers, and even wished her a pleasant evening. For an entire week afterward, nothing happened, and she'd almost managed to convince herself that no one knew, until this afternoon. This afternoon, when she arrived for her shift, Dana, the young bartender, pulled her into the linen storage room, her face drained of all color, whispering that she'd overheard 2 of Mercer's men talking in the back hallway, that the security camera on the 3rd floor had recorded everything, that the order had come down not to touch the girl while the restaurant was crowded because the boss didn't want any trouble in front of Donovan tonight. Just wait until her shift ended. The employee parking lot, 2 o'clock in the morning. Dana clutched her trembling hand and begged her to run right then, but Tessa knew exactly what running meant. She had no car, no money, nowhere she could disappear where Mercer's men wouldn't find her before sunrise, and the only employee exit not already guarded by his men was the one leading directly to where they were waiting. If there was still a door leading to life, it would only remain open for a few more hours, and it stood beside the corner table where the man the entire city feared was sitting. The soft chime from the kitchen announcing the main course was ready pulled her back to the present. Tessa drew one long breath, tore a small sheet from the order pad tucked into her apron pocket, and in quick, tiny handwriting, she spent 20 seconds writing the words she'd been composing in her mind throughout those past 12 minutes. Then she folded the paper into quarters, concealed it inside her left palm, lifted the bottle of red wine, and walked toward the corner table with the steady steps of an ordinary waitress, carrying out an ordinary part of her job. Mercer was saying something about real estate projects on the southern side of the city. Gray listened with the patience of solid stone. Tessa poured Mercer's wine first, filling the glass exactly 1/3 full, gently twisting the bottle so not a single drop would fall, then walked around to Gray's side of the table, and as she leaned forward, the service towel draped across her arm slipped from its fold and fell beside the table leg. She lowered herself onto one knee to retrieve it, a movement lasting no more than 3 seconds. And during those 3 seconds, so softly that only one man in the entire world could hear her, she whispered 3 words, "Help me, please." Then she stood again, finished pouring the wine, and with her left hand placed the fresh bread basket onto the table, adjusting the small plate beneath it the way every attentive server would, except that when her hand withdrew, the folded piece of paper remained beneath the rim of the plate, hidden from Mercer's view, resting beside Grayson Donovan's right wrist. She excused herself in a flawless professional voice and walked back toward the service counter, without moving a single beat faster than usual, even though her spine felt as cold as though ice water were slowly running down it. Gray didn't watch her leave. He continued listening to Mercer for another 40 seconds before casually breaking off a piece of bread, and the folded note disappeared into his palm as quietly as though it had never existed. Only when Mercer lowered his head to cut into the meat on his plate did Gray slip his hand beneath the edge of the table and unfold the paper with a single thumb. The handwriting was small, slanted, written in haste but never messy. The handwriting of someone overwhelmed by terror yet desperately struggling to keep her thoughts steady. "Mercer's men are going to take me from the employee parking lot at 2 o'clock this morning. I saw his black notebook, the money laundering, the shipments, and what really happened to Manager Reyes. I can't go to the police because he has people inside Precinct 9. I have no one left to trust. If you're just like him, please pretend you've never read these words, and I'm sorry for disturbing your dinner. But if you're different from him, even just a little, then I'm begging you, please help me." Gray folded the note with a single movement of his thumb, slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and continued the dinner for exactly 4 more minutes, as though the words he'd just read had been nothing more than a wine receipt. Then he laid down his knife and fork, excused himself with half a sentence, and walked toward the private restroom at the end of the stone-lined hallway. He locked the door, turned on the faucet, and stood there looking at the man in the mirror. For the past 15 years, this entire city had called the man in that reflection Donovan, speaking the name the way people spoke about bad weather, something nobody wanted to face but nobody could avoid. Men who owed money had knelt before him. Men who'd betrayed him had wept before him. One man had once placed an entire stack of photographs of his own children on the table while begging for 1 more week. Gray had heard every plea, and not once had his heartbeat changed. Yet the 3 whispered words of a waitress he'd never met, spoken in the space of 3 seconds beside a table leg, were now doing what no desperate plea had managed to do in 15 years. They were knocking against a door buried deep inside him, a door he'd believed he'd bricked shut long ago. And from behind that sealed door, without warning, a fragment of memory rose to the surface, the smell of chicken soup. Not the kind served in restaurants like this, but the smell of soup simmering inside a cramped kitchen, rich and hot, filled with onions and black pepper. A blue-painted wooden sign with paint peeling away at the corners, swaying gently in the cold wind. A woman's hand, its fingers reddened from hot water, placing a steaming bowl of soup onto the wooden table in front of him. That was all. The memory broke apart there, like a strip of film cut cleanly with a pair of scissors. There was no face, no voice, no name. Gray stood motionless before the mirror for another 5 seconds, trying to pull the rest of that forgotten film out of the darkness, and failed. 18 years had passed since he'd allowed himself to think about that winter. The winter when he'd been 16 years old. The part of his life he'd boxed away, sealed shut, and buried in the deepest corner of his memory along with his old name. He didn't understand why it had surfaced now. Why tonight? Why because of this girl? He only knew one thing, and 15 years of surviving had taught him never to argue with this instinct. Some warnings didn't come from reason, and the people who ignored them rarely lived long enough to regret it. He shut off the water, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, and when he stepped out of the restroom, his face had once again become the face the city knew, as still as the surface of a lake in January. He returned to the table and did exactly what made Boyd Mercer smile to himself in quiet satisfaction. He ordered another bottle of wine. In the language of dinners like this, ordering another bottle meant you wanted to keep talking, and wanting to keep talking meant there was still room to negotiate. And Mercer, a man who'd spent his entire career reading people through gestures like that, relaxed his shoulders just a fraction more. What he couldn't see was what was happening beneath the edge of the table, where Gray's left hand rested on his thigh, his thumb moving across the screen of his phone entirely from memory without looking, entering a short string of characters into an encrypted channel that only one person in the world could receive. Jonah Walsh was sitting inside a car parked 3 blocks away from the restaurant, and the message that appeared on his phone contained only a handful of phrases, as dry as a telegram. One person, female, restaurant employee, pick up at 9:45, rear storage door behind the kitchen, prepare safe house, call Margot. Jonah read it twice, raised an eyebrow at the empty space in front of him, and replied with a single character that in the private language shared between the two men meant understood, already moving. The rest of the dinner became a chess match in which both players knew the other was hiding pieces. Mercer talked about the future of the South Side, about the buildings that would soon rise there, about how people with vision belonged on the same side, and Gray nodded where nodding was expected, asked questions where questions belonged, and allowed just enough carefully measured silence for Mercer to believe he was gaining the advantage. By the end of the meal, Mercer lifted his glass and said he believed tonight marked the beginning of a new chapter between them. Gray raised his own glass, touched it lightly against Mercer's, and took a sip. Both men smiled. Both men knew exactly what that new chapter was called. The only difference was that one of them believed it would begin in the employee parking lot at 2 o'clock that morning, while the other already knew it had begun 4 minutes earlier, beneath the edge of a table covered with a white cloth. Gray rose first, buttoned his suit jacket, shook Mercer's hand with a handshake lasting precisely 2 seconds, and headed toward the elevator. His path took him past the service counter, where Tessa was arranging glasses onto a tray, her shoulders held straight by the sheer force of determination it took simply to remain standing. He didn't stop. He didn't turn his head. He merely slowed his stride by half a beat as he passed her, and in a voice so low it disappeared into the sound of glass touching glass, he spoke exactly 1 sentence. 9:45, the storage door behind the kitchen. Then he kept walking without changing his pace, and the elevator doors closed behind him. Tessa remained standing there, still holding the glass she hadn't managed to set down, her heart pounding like a battlefield drum, and for the first time since that Tuesday afternoon, there was something inside her chest greater than fear itself. She glanced at the clock hanging above the bar. 17 minutes past 9. 28 minutes remained. Those 28 minutes became the longest 28 minutes of Tessa's life. She worked like a machine following a program, clearing tables, serving desserts, smiling at guests who never truly saw her, while her eyes followed the clock above the bar, as its hands crept forward 1 mark at a time. At 22 minutes before 10, she untied her apron, folded it, and draped it over her arm, as though she were simply taking dirty linens down to the laundry room, something she did every night, something no one ever paid attention to. At 19 minutes before 10, she crossed through the kitchen, nodded to the head chef who was shouting about the salmon, and turned into the hallway leading down to the storage area. At 17 minutes before 10, she heard something that wasn't supposed to be there, the sound of leather shoes against the concrete floor ahead, near the corner leading to the storage door. Mercer's men had moved into position earlier than expected, perhaps because Donovan had already left the restaurant and their boss had grown restless, perhaps because it was simply the instinct of hunting dogs. The reason no longer mattered. What mattered was that between her and the door where she'd been told to go stood 2 men, and one of them had just called her name, in the voice of someone who had no intention of asking questions. Tessa froze for half a second. During that half second, her body acted without waiting for permission from her mind. Both hands wrapped the folded apron around her right fist, winding it tighter and tighter, exactly the way she'd once watched her mother do on the night the very first debt collector had pounded on the apartment door years ago. It was the gesture of women who had no one to protect them and had learned to make themselves as difficult to swallow as possible. Then she ran, not toward them, but to the left, crashing through the heavy door of the walk-in freezer where freezing air struck her face like a slap, and rows of hanging cuts of meat breathed pale white mist beneath the cold blue lights. The footsteps behind her quickened. She darted between two stainless steel racks, shoved a stack of plastic trays into the aisle behind her, heard one of the men slip and curse, then raced toward the small door at the far end of the freezer, the one leading into the garbage area that only long-time employees knew could never be locked, because the hinges had been bent, ever since the days of managers nobody even remembered anymore. She slammed her shoulder into the door, burst into the trash collection yard lined with steel dumpsters nearly as tall as her chest. The heavy air thick with the smell of old cooking oil, and behind her the crooked door burst open again, much sooner than she'd expected. A hand caught the shoulder of her shirt and yanked her backward. Tessa spun with the force of the pull and drove the fist wrapped in her apron straight into the man's face with every ounce of fear she'd been carrying for an entire week. The punch wasn't powerful enough to bring him down, but it was enough to make him hesitate for a heartbeat, releasing her as both hands flew to his face. One heartbeat was all she needed to stumble 3 steps backward toward the alley exit, but the second man had already circled around to block her path, spreading his arms the way someone herded frightened chickens, smiling with the certainty of a man convinced the game was already over. And in that moment, standing between 2 men inside the garbage yard behind the restaurant, her back pressed against the freezing steel wall of a dumpster, Tessa suddenly thought of her mother. Not a particular memory, only a feeling, an apology because she hadn't managed to make it any farther. Then the darkness behind the second man moved. Tessa never saw exactly what happened. Even afterward, no matter how hard she tried to remember, she could never reconstruct the sequence completely. All that remained were scattered fragments, a hand reaching from behind to seize the second man's shoulder and turn him aside as effortlessly as opening a door. A leg sweeping beneath him, lifting both feet from the ground, the heavy, clean sound of a body striking concrete. Then the man remained there, not unconscious, not motionless, simply stripped of every desire to stand again. The first man lowered his hands from his face, saw what had happened, and made the mistake of charging forward. Grayson Donovan didn't retreat. He stepped diagonally half a pace, letting the man's momentum slide past him the way water flowed around stone, caught the man's arm in mid-motion, and with a movement so short it was almost humble, placed him onto the concrete beside his partner, one knee pinning the middle of his back, while one hand locked his wrist behind him at an angle. The human body simply wasn't built to resist. The man hissed and tried to struggle. Gray increased the pressure by the smallest fraction. The struggling stopped. The entire encounter lasted less than 15 seconds. There wasn't a single scream, not a single drop of anything touched the ground. There was only the breathing of 3 men and the pounding of Tessa's heart inside her ears. Gray removed both men's phones from their jacket pockets, dropped them onto the concrete, crushed each one beneath the heel of his shoe without hesitation, then stood, adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket, as though he'd just finished a business meeting, and looked at Tessa, giving her a quick examination from head to toe to make certain she wasn't hurt. Then he nodded toward the end of the alley. "Go." She went. Her legs were still shaking, but they didn't slow her pace. He followed half a step behind, his body angled just enough to place himself between her and the entrance to the garbage yard, until the headlights of a black car waiting at the far end of the alley flashed once. Jonah Walsh sat behind the wheel and leaned over to open the rear door before they reached it. The expression on his face when he saw the restaurant waitress climb into the car, followed by his own boss with a streak of concrete dust across the knee of his suit trousers, was the expression of a man who decided his questions could wait until later. The car rolled smoothly out of the alley, merged into the glowing stream of Chicago's night traffic, and only after they'd traveled 3 city blocks did Tessa finally find her voice again. She turned toward the man sitting in the front passenger seat and spoke her first words since the whisper beside the table leg, her breathing still uneven. "Those 2 men. They saw your face." Gray kept his eyes on the road ahead through the windshield and answered in the calm tone of someone commenting on the weather. "Good. Saves me the trouble of introducing myself." The car drove for another 20 minutes, changed direction 3 times, slipped through an underground parking garage, and finally stopped in front of a red brick building without a sign on the edge of the old industrial district. The apartment on the 4th floor looked nothing like anything Tessa had imagined for the hideout of a crime boss. There was no velvet, no gold, only bare walls. Thick curtains drawn tightly across the windows, one long table, a few chairs, and a woman with cropped hair sitting behind 2 computer monitors, who looked up as they entered, with the expression of someone who'd already been warned they were coming, but still preferred to verify everything herself. "Margot Hayes," Gray said briefly, replacing every formal introduction with those 2 words. "Give her your phone." Tessa took the phone from her pocket, her finger lingering on the screen for 1 second before handing it over. Those 6 photographs were the entire fortune her life depended upon, and giving them to strangers was the second gamble she'd taken that night. But she'd passed the point of having any road back the moment she'd knelt to pick up the towel beside the table. Margot connected the phone to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, and while the photographs were uploaded onto a secure server somewhere no one bothered asking about, she glanced through their contents, her eyebrows drawing closer together with every image. "Sit down," Gray said. Tessa sat carefully on the edge of the chair, both hands resting on her lap, her back perfectly straight, like someone attending a job interview, instead of a woman who'd just escaped 2 kidnappers. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." And she did. At first her voice broke now and then, but gradually it became steadier, like someone reading a statement she'd memorized because she'd spent too long living inside it. Her mother's name had been June Monroe. She'd owned a small neighborhood diner and raised Tessa alone after her father walked away when she was 4 years old. 3 years earlier, her mother had fallen seriously ill, spending 8 months in the hospital, and when she died, all she'd left behind was a handwritten recipe book, a small pendant, and a mountain of hospital debt that an entire lifetime of waiting tables would have never touched beyond the principal. Then one day, someone bought the debt from the hospital. Tessa received a letter inviting her to the office of a real estate company, and behind the desk sat Boyd Mercer wearing a warm smile and offering a refinancing agreement with an interest rate she'd had to read 3 separate times before believing her own eyes. From that day forward, she'd worked at Ember Room, his restaurant. Her wages went directly toward the interest payments, and every month the total climbed higher instead of lower, a well digging itself deeper beneath her feet every single day. She told them about Reyes, the gray-haired manager who'd confided that the numbers didn't add up, then disappeared after one weekend, and about the name crossed out in red ink she'd seen inside Mercer's black notebook. Gray listened without interrupting, leaning against the wall with both arms folded across his chest, and only after she'd finished did he ask a single question. "Why didn't you run this afternoon when you learned they were waiting for you in the parking lot?" Tessa met his eyes, and for the first time all evening, there was something in her voice stronger than fear. "Run where?" she asked. "I don't have a car. He can see every dollar in my bank account. Anyone who gives me shelter becomes his next debtor. I'd already thought through every possibility, sir. The only road that doesn't lead back to Mercer's office is the one that goes straight through him." Margot lifted her eyes from the screen and shot Gray a quick glance, the kind of glance someone gave after hearing something worth remembering. Tessa drew one slow breath and continued with the part she'd rehearsed throughout the drive, the hardest part to say aloud. "But there's something you need to understand before we go any further. I know who you are. I know people like me don't get to sit in a room like this for free. If you save me only so I wake up tomorrow with a new creditor, one who just happens to wear a better suit, then please let me out on the nearest street corner right now. I won't trade one creditor for another. I'd rather keep running on my own until there's nowhere left to run." The room fell silent for 3 full seconds. Jonah, halfway through pouring himself a cup of coffee in the kitchen corner, stopped in mid-motion. Margot's fingers left the keyboard, and Gray looked at the young woman sitting upright on the edge of that chair for one heartbeat longer than necessary, because there was something in those words, in the way she'd lifted her chin, ready to lose everything except her right not to kneel, that touched him in a way he couldn't name, familiar like a melody heard sometime in a life so distant he couldn't remember the lyrics anymore. "No one owns anyone here," he finally said, his voice unchanged. "You give me what I need, the truth about Mercer. I give you what you need, your life. Fair enough. If you can sleep, then sleep." The room at the end of the hall locks from the inside. Tessa looked at him for another second, as though weighing those words on an invisible scale, then nodded. But before anyone could leave their place, Margot let out a low whistle through her teeth, the sound making both Gray and Jonah turn toward her monitor at once. "Only 6 pages, Margot said, "but they tell one hell of a story. This isn't just a debt ledger. It's a cash flow ledger, And Mercer's money is moving in a very strange way. She turned the monitor toward them. He's draining every source he has and funneling it all into one place. Every transaction carries the same code. And look at this deadline. There's a shipment moving through the harbor. The payoff money stretches from Precinct 9 all the way to the prosecutor's office, and the whole operation has to be finished exactly 1 week from now. Jonah frowned. What's happening next week? Margot tapped a few more keys, opened a local news article, and on the screen appeared a photograph of Boyd Mercer, smiling beside the scale model of an extravagant development complex. Next week, she said. He breaks ground on the biggest project of his life. It'll be broadcast live. The mayor will be there. The room fell silent. Gray stepped closer to the monitor, looked at the groundbreaking date, looked at the shipment date, looked at the river of money rushing together as though pouring into the narrow mouth of a funnel, and spoke softly, almost to himself. Everything he has is flowing toward the same day. Tessa went to rest in the room at the end of the hall just before midnight, while the 3 people remaining gathered around the long table with the 6 enlarged pages from the black notebook, spread across the monitor like maps leading into the heart of a beast. Margot worked the way she always did, disappearing into long stretches of silence, before suddenly speaking in rapid bursts. And close to 1 o'clock in the morning, she leaned back in her chair, rubbed both eyes, and said the one thing neither Gray nor Jonah wanted to hear. There's something on the last page that I thought was ordinary bookkeeping, but it isn't. Look at this notes column. 3 abbreviations repeated over and over, 1 case reference number, and 1 name that took me half an hour to trace. It's a senior assistant inside the district attorney's office. Mercer hasn't just bought people in Precinct 9. He's built an entire pipeline reaching all the way to a prosecutor's desk. But that's not the frightening part. She enlarged a handwritten note in the margin, Mercer's own neat, compact handwriting, and read each word slowly, as though reading the label on a bottle of poison. Insurance package. Copy already delivered. Activate if I go silent. Jonah frowned. What does that mean? It means, Margot replied, Mercer has already assembled a complete file, and judging by the money tied to this code, he spent a fortune making every page look authentic, right down to every official seal. It's a fabricated case accusing our organization of crimes he invented himself. Shipments that never existed. Names attached to investigations that never happened. That file is already locked inside the safe belonging to that assistant prosecutor, along with one simple instruction. If Boyd Mercer dies, disappears, or stops sending regular confirmation signals, open the safe, file the charges, and bring Donovan down. The room became so quiet they could hear the cooling fan inside the computer. Jonah let out a long, low whistle, folded his arms, and gave voice to the thought all 3 of them shared. A dead man's switch. No wonder he sat across from you tonight without a single drop of sweat on his hands. He knew you couldn't touch him. The whole city thinks Mercer is reckless. Turns out he's the only man in the room who has nothing to fear. Gray rose slowly from his chair, walked toward the window hidden behind the heavy curtains, and stood there for a long time with both hands in his pockets. 15 years of ruling the underworld had taught him that every problem had 3 solutions. Buy it, frighten it, or erase it. And he'd just realized Mercer had locked every one of those doors before dinner had even begun. He couldn't be bought because what Mercer wanted wasn't money. It was Gray's territory. He couldn't be intimidated because a man holding a dead man's switch feared no one. And he couldn't be eliminated because the bullet that killed Mercer would also fire the fabricated case waiting inside the prosecutor's safe, dragging Gray's organization, Jonah, Margot, and the hundreds of people living beneath his protection into the grave, alongside a dead man. He turned back toward the table. Then there's a 4th door, he said in the same calm voice, someone might use while reading a dinner menu. Margot looked up. Which one? The truth, Gray answered. Mercer survives because he wears 2 layers of armor. The outer layer is the image of a respectable businessman in the public eye. The inner layer is that dead man's switch, but the switch only works if he dies or disappears. If he collapses in broad daylight, wearing handcuffs, with his real crimes exposed before television cameras, then that fake case becomes nothing but worthless paper, because no prosecutor would dare open a safe and carry out the instructions of a criminal who's just been arrested in front of the entire country. If we're going to destroy Mercer without dying beside him, we can't use bullets. We have to use the truth, out in the open, and every step has to follow the law down to the last comma. Jonah stared at his employer for a long moment, And on the face of the man who'd stood beside Gray for 15 years appeared something almost never seen there. Hesitation. The law, he repeated. Do you hear yourself? We're not people who live by the law. Precinct 9 belongs to him. The prosecutors belong to him. You just finished saying that yourself. The road you're describing isn't a fourth door. It's a tightrope stretched across a canyon, and waiting on the other side is total war against a man with more money than us, more people inside the system than us, and none of the rules that still hold your hands back. He leaned forward with both palms pressed against the table, and finally asked the question he'd been carrying ever since opening the car door for a waitress they'd known for less than 3 hours. I've followed you since the days when neither of us had anything. If you told me to jump, I jumped. If you told me to stay silent, I stayed silent. But tonight I need to understand what I'm jumping for. For a waitress you've known less than 3 hours, you're willing to start a war with Boyd Mercer? The room fell silent. Margot stopped typing. She didn't raise her head, but it was obvious she was listening. Gray didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the tabletop where the glow from the monitor spilled across the 6 pages of the black notebook, and for one fleeting instant, so brief that only Jonah, after 15 years of reading this man's face, noticed it. Something shifted behind those eyes that were usually as still as a frozen lake. Something old, something buried deep, something that had nothing at all to do with territory or money. It's not because of her, Gray finally said, his voice dropping half a tone. It's because of a debt she doesn't even know I'm carrying. Jonah straightened, waiting for the rest of the answer, but the rest never came. Gray buttoned his suit jacket once more and walked toward the small office at the end of the hallway, leaving behind the 2 people who'd been more loyal to him than anyone else, along with a question suspended in the middle of the room. What debt? Owed to whom? Since when? And how enormous did it have to be for the man who ruled the entire South Side with the coldest mind in the city to place his entire empire on the table as a wager because of it? At 3 o'clock in the morning, Tessa gave up trying to sleep. The room at the end of the hall had a sturdy lock exactly as Gray had promised, but a lock could secure a door, not a mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself back in the employee parking lot at 2 o'clock that morning, only in another version of the night, the version where there'd been no folded note beneath the bread plate. She climbed out of bed, walked quietly through the dark hallway, and found what she needed at the far end of the apartment, a small but fully equipped kitchen. The refrigerator held chicken, carrots, onions, the simple ingredients someone had stocked for the days when staying hidden meant staying alive. She stood there for a long moment, then did the one thing she'd done ever since she was 10 years old, whenever the world grew too large for her to carry. She cooked her mother's chicken soup. The handwritten recipe book was still back in her apartment inside the drawer beside her bed. By now, Mercer's men had probably turned the whole place upside down looking through it, but that didn't matter, because she didn't need the book for this recipe. It lived in her hands, in her sense of smell, somewhere deeper than memory itself. Brown the onions first until they released their sweetness. Blanch the chicken before letting it simmer. Slice the carrots thick enough that they wouldn't fall apart. Crush the black pepper instead of grinding it. And above all, be patient. Her mother had always said patience was the most important ingredient. You can't rush a pot of soup any more than you can rush an act of kindness. She moved through each step beneath the warm yellow glow of the range hood light, and when the soup finally began to bubble gently, filling the kitchen with that rich, comforting fragrance of onions and cracked black pepper, her shoulders lowered by the smallest fraction. For the first time since that afternoon, she never heard the footsteps. The man moved without making a sound, even inside his own home. And when Tessa turned to reach for the ladle, she startled to find Grayson Donovan standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the same white shirt from earlier that evening, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, frozen in place in the most literal sense of the word, like someone who'd been stopped mid-stride by an invisible wall. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the pot of soup, or more accurately, he was breathing in its scent with his entire face, wearing an expression she'd never seen on him throughout the entire night, not even when he'd taken down the 2 men behind the restaurant. It was an expression completely unguarded, completely exposed, as though for one brief second the most dangerous man in the city had forgotten who he was. "I'm sorry," Tessa said softly. "I couldn't sleep. I always cook when I'm frightened. It's been my habit since I was little. I'll clean everything afterward." Gray didn't answer that. He walked slowly into the kitchen, pulled out the stool beside the counter, sat down, and asked in a voice entirely different from the one he'd used while giving orders earlier that night. "Where did you learn to make this?" "From my mother," Tessa answered as she ladled the soup into 2 bowls out of the simple courtesy of someone borrowing another person's kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning. "My mother owned a little diner when I was growing up. It was on the corner of Halstead. Just a tiny place, with a blue-painted wooden sign. She painted it herself, so the paint was peeling at every corner." Gray's hand, reaching to accept the bowl, stopped in midair for exactly half a second. If Tessa hadn't happened to glance down at that instant, she would have missed it. She assumed he simply didn't care for such humble food, so she hurried to say, "You don't have to eat it. I was just making it for myself." But he'd already taken the bowl, set it carefully on the counter before him, and quietly said, "Tell me more about that diner." So at 3 o'clock in the morning, inside the kitchen of a safe apartment with no address, Tessa Monroe found herself telling the crime boss of the South Side about a little diner that had closed its doors long ago. She told him how her mother had opened it alone after her father walked away. She told him about the winters when customers were scarce, and her mother still kept a pot of soup warm on the stove until closing time. And she told him about the rule everyone in the neighborhood had known back then, the 1-bowl rule. Anyone who knocked on the back door hungry got a bowl of soup, she said. My mother never asked their name, never asked why they were hungry, never made them listen to a lecture. Just 1 hot bowl of soup and a place to sit on the back steps. When I was little, I asked her once how we could afford to keep feeding strangers when we barely had enough ourselves. I asked what if people took advantage of her. Tessa smiled into the steam rising from her own bowl, the first genuine smile she'd worn throughout the long story of that night. My mother was washing her hands at the sink. She didn't even turn around. She only said, "People don't owe each other a meal, sweetheart. People owe each other kindness." Silence settled over the kitchen, and within that silence, inside the mind of the man sitting at the counter, a second fragment of memory rose and locked itself perfectly into the first. The blue wooden sign with peeling paint inside his memory had also stood on a street corner, a corner he'd spent the past 18 years deliberately driving around rather than passing through. And those words, the ones about food and kindness, he'd heard them before, not read them, not been told about them. He'd heard them with his own ears, spoken in the voice of a woman, in a place filled with warmth during the coldest winter of his life. Coincidence, he told himself. This city has hundreds of diners, thousands of blue signs. Anyone could have said something like that. He crushed the thought as quickly as someone snuffed out a match, because there were doors that could never be closed again once opened, and he wasn't ready. Not tonight, not while Mercer was still out there. He said nothing at all. He simply picked up the spoon and began to eat. He ate slowly, 1 spoonful at a time, sitting perfectly straight, leaving not a single drop behind. Not like a man having a bowl of soup, but like someone carrying out a sacred ritual. And Tessa stood on the opposite side of the kitchen counter, watching the strangest sight she'd ever witnessed. The man whose name made an entire city lower its voice sitting on a kitchen stool at 3 o'clock in the morning, eating a waitress's chicken soup, as though it were the most important meal of his entire life. And when he finally lowered his spoon into the empty bowl, so quietly that it was almost impossible to hear, Tessa saw something she was certain very few people in this world had ever witnessed. Grayson Donovan's hand, the hand that had signed death sentences and broken empires, the hand that hadn't shed a single drop of sweat sitting across from Boyd Mercer, was trembling. Boyd Mercer wasn't the kind of man who slammed his fist on the table after losing a game. He was the kind who quietly cleared the table and arranged a new one. And by the following morning, before the city had even finished its first cup of coffee, his new game was already in place, with 3 moves laid out in succession like 3 carefully aimed knife strikes. The first move traveled through Precinct 9. At 9 o'clock that morning, a brand new criminal complaint appeared in the department's system. Ember Room accused one of its waitresses, Tessa Monroe, of stealing cash from the restaurant's safe over the course of several months. Attached to the report were statements from 2 restaurant employees and carefully edited security footage, convincing enough to appear completely authentic. The warrant to locate her was approved with unusual speed under the signature of a man whose name Margot would have immediately recognized from the list of officials receiving regular payments from Mercer. By noon, Tessa's photograph had already been distributed through the internal files of patrol units across the city. Overnight, a 26-year-old waitress had become a fugitive suspected of financial crimes, and every police officer in Chicago now possessed a perfectly legal reason to place handcuffs on her and deliver her directly to the place where Mercer's men were already waiting. The second move never touched a single official document. It moved through brief phone calls, hurried meetings in parking lots and back rooms of neighborhood bars, and by late afternoon the entire Chicago underworld knew something no one dared speak aloud. Boyd Mercer had placed a bounty on a waitress. Alive. The amount was large enough that the most experienced bounty hunters in the state abandoned whatever jobs they'd been working, and attached to that reward came a message requiring no encryption at all. Anyone who gave the girl shelter had already chosen a side. The third move arrived by hand. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, a well-dressed man quietly laid a thick envelope, without stamps or markings, onto the counter of a small laundromat in the South Side, one of the public-facing contact points everyone in their world knew ultimately led to Donovan. Inside the envelope lay only a single sheet of paper, bearing Mercer's own clean, elegant handwriting. Grayson, last night's dinner was delightful, but I'm afraid one of my possessions has wandered into your house. The girl stole from me. The paperwork is complete. The law stands with me. Return her before groundbreaking day and every misunderstanding between us disappears. Your harbor remains yours. The old boundaries remain respected. We might even become friends. Keep her, and you'll teach this entire city a very expensive lesson about the price of kindness. You have until Thursday morning. Inside the safe apartment, Gray read the letter exactly once beneath the watchful eyes of Jonah and Margot, then quietly laid it on the table and did absolutely nothing. He wrote no reply, sent no intermediary, not even a verbal message. Jonah understood immediately, because he'd spent enough years beside this man to know the language Gray spoke without words. Silence wasn't hesitation. Silence was an answer. The proudest answer imaginable. I heard you. I refuse. You aren't worth a single word from me. But Mercer understood that language just as well, and beginning that very evening, the noose began to tighten. It tightened the way modern wars always did. There were no gunshots, only pressure increasing from every direction, like rising water surrounding an island. Patrol cars from Precinct 9 suddenly began cruising slowly past businesses connected to Donovan 3 times more often than usual. 2 longtime suppliers serving Gray's nightclubs called within hours of each other, apologizing awkwardly, before refusing to make any further deliveries. A broker who'd done business with Donovan's organization for years was suddenly summoned to the station over a business permit that had expired the previous year. Something nobody had cared about until now. Then, at 10 o'clock that night, Jonah's phone vibrated with the first piece of bad news attached to a specific address. The laundromat in the South Side, the same one that had received Mercer's envelope earlier that afternoon, had just been visited by 4 officers from Precinct 9, claiming to perform a fire safety inspection. They'd searched every storage bin, removed ceiling panels, forced the owner to remain seated for 2 hours while repeating the same question in different forms. Had he seen any unfamiliar young woman recently? Jonah ended the call, reported everything to the room, then concluded in the calm voice of a soldier reading battlefield positions. He couldn't find her, so now he's squeezing every pipeline leading toward us, one by one. Eventually, he'll reach the ones closest to home. Tessa spent the entire evening sitting quietly at the corner of the table listening to every word, her face growing paler with each passing hour, until finally she spoke so softly it was almost a whisper. Maybe I should turn myself in. A good lawyer might beat a made-up theft charge. That's better than watching your whole organization sink because of me. Gray didn't even lift his eyes from the harbor map spread across the table. If you walk into Precinct 9, he replied in the same level voice. Before any lawyer reaches you, your file will already say you resisted arrest, and everything that happens afterward will conveniently appear on the station cameras, exactly where Mercer wants it recorded. Surrender is simply a polite word for delivering yourself to the address Mercer selected. Sit down. You're a witness, not a burden, and I don't hand witnesses back to the man who needs them dead. The sentence contained not a single comforting word, yet strangely enough it allowed Tessa to sit back down, because inside the upside-down world she'd been thrown into, the only thing still worthy of trust was precisely that kind of cold discipline, built upon principles. No one truly slept that night. Jonah remained on the phone, coordinating with their various locations, quietly relocating 3 different groups away from addresses most likely to receive the next round of unwanted visits. Gray stood before the large city map pinned to the wall, his eyes moving endlessly between the harbor, Ember Room, and Mercer's construction site as though searching for one missing connection he still couldn't see. And Margot. Margot remained buried behind her 2 computer monitors from midnight onward, with her 3rd can of energy drink, following a single thread she'd told no one about, a thread beginning with one simple question that had refused to leave her mind since the previous day. Why had Mercer's bribery payments begun 3 full years earlier, long before he'd ever publicly announced the development project? She dug through the city's property records layer after layer. Shell companies nested inside one another like wooden dolls hidden within larger wooden dolls. And shortly before 5 o'clock in the morning, while dawn still hadn't begun to brighten the sky, Margot's fingers suddenly froze above the keyboard. She stared motionlessly at the monitor for a full 10 seconds, before finally raising her head toward Gray, who was still standing before the city map, and spoke in a voice that caused both Jonah and Tessa to turn immediately toward her. "You need to see this." Gray walked over to the monitor with Jonah following close behind, while Tessa rose from the corner of the table with the unmistakable feeling that whatever was about to appear had something to do with her. Margot pulled up the master plan for Mercer's development on the left screen, the dazzling complex of glass towers he was preparing to break ground on before television cameras, then opened an old municipal land survey map on the right screen and overlaid the two with a few quick movements. "Look at the property lines," she said. "The entire development sits on top of 4 old city blocks that have been cleared little by little over the past 3 years. And the last block, the one directly in the center of the project where the main lobby of the central tower is supposed to stand, is this street right here." Margot tapped one line on the map, and beside it appeared the name of a street that caused 2 people in the room to fall silent the instant they saw it. Halsted. Tessa stepped closer to the monitor, her voice growing softer as though she were afraid of waking something that had been sleeping for years. "That's my old neighborhood. My mother's diner was right there. The old address is still on her paperwork." Margot nodded slowly. "Now here's the part you need to listen to very carefully," she said without taking her eyes off Gray. 3 years ago, before this project even had a name, Mercer's shell companies began quietly buying every property along Halsted, one by one. But several owners refused to sell. Families who'd lived there for decades. People running small businesses who believed that street corner was their entire life. For those owners, the records reveal a pattern so consistent it's chilling. Anyone with a loan suddenly had that loan purchased, and the interest rates driven through the roof. Anyone carrying hospital debt found that debt transferred to a new owner. Anyone operating a business suddenly ran into endless licensing problems. One household after another finally broke, sold at a loss, and moved away. Margot opened a scanned file from the city's archived records, turned to one notarized page, and on the monitor appeared a debt transfer agreement dated almost 3 years earlier. The buyer was an anonymous limited liability company, whose true ownership Margot had already traced, and the debtor's name printed on the document was the name Tessa barely managed to begin reading before the words caught in her throat. June Monroe. The room became utterly silent. "Your mother's hospital debt," Margot said, her voice softer than Tessa had ever heard it, "wasn't accidentally sold to Mercer. He hunted it down. He bought it while your mother was still lying in that hospital bed, then inflated the interest, until he made absolutely certain the 2 of you could never repay it, because your mother's diner sat on the exact piece of land he wanted, and men like him don't force people out with violence when numbers can accomplish the same thing. The pit of debt you've been trapped inside for the past 3 years wasn't bad luck. It was dug in advance, measured in advance, built precisely for your family." Tessa stood motionless with both arms hanging at her sides, while the past 3 years rearranged themselves inside her mind, piece by piece, into a completely different picture. The afternoon when the hospital called to explain that a third party had purchased the debt and assured her it was completely routine. The letters announcing ever-increasing interest rates. Mercer's sympathetic smile from behind his wooden desk, the day he'd offered her a job at Ember Room so she could work off the debt. Her mother, during those final months, struggling to sit upright while calculating whether selling the diner might finally be enough. And the way that little diner with the blue sign had eventually closed its doors, changed hands, and now rested squarely inside the boundaries of a multi-billion-dollar development. The man who'd crushed the final years of her mother's life, and the man who'd placed a bounty on her own life, were one and the same. And he'd done both, wearing the very same smile. She didn't cry. Tears belonged to grief smaller than this. She asked only one question, her voice quiet and perfectly steady. "Did my mother know? I mean, did she ever suspect?" No one in the room could answer that question, and somehow that silence became the kindest answer anyone could have given. Jonah ran a hand through his hair and let out a weary breath through his teeth. Margot turned back toward her monitors, as though trying to give Tessa a little space. Only Gray never took his eyes off the young woman standing in the middle of the room, and anyone paying close enough attention would have noticed that his jaw was tightening second by second because another calculation had just finished inside his own mind. The blue wooden sign from his memory had stood on Halstead. The woman from his memory had been named June Monroe, and the ground that had once given shelter to a boy nobody wanted was now about to be buried beneath concrete to build a monument honoring the very man who'd destroyed that woman. He still told no one. Not yet, but when he finally spoke, everyone in the room heard something new beneath his usual calm voice, something colder than ever before, and buried at the deepest point beneath that coldness burned something intensely hot. "Thursday morning," he said, "Mercer will stand on Halstead before the mayor and before cameras across the entire city to turn the first shovel of dirt for the project that defines his life. He chose that place for his coronation. Then that's exactly where he'll fall." No one asked what he meant because the sentence hadn't been spoken as an invitation to discuss possibilities. It landed like a verdict already passed. The rest of the night disappeared into maps, financial flowcharts, and plans sketched out only to be crossed away again as their strategy slowly took shape, line by line, like a ship being built under the cover of darkness. None of the four people gathered around that long table that night knew that somewhere else in the city, on a prepaid phone resting in the palm of someone they trusted, the address of the safe apartment had just been typed out and sent. The following night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Gray sat studying the city map beneath the only desk lamp still burning when the back of his neck turned cold, before his ears even understood why. Then his hearing caught up. Down on the street below came the sound of 3 car doors closing, far too softly and far too evenly for any honest reason at that hour. There were no voices, no laughter from late-night revelers heading home, only the organized silence of people arriving to do a job. He switched off the lamp with a twist of his wrist, crossed the living room in darkness, knocked twice sharply on Margot's door, yanked open the bedroom where Tessa was sleeping, and spoke exactly 3 words in the low voice that never invited questions. "Up, move, now." Jonah was already off the sofa where he'd been sleeping on watch, reacting with the instincts of an old soldier who never needed anyone pounding on his door. And over the next 40 seconds, the safe apartment functioned exactly the way it had been designed to function for a moment like this. Margot swept her laptop and 2 hard drives into her shoulder bag. Tessa pulled on her shoes with trembling hands, even though her feet were already steady beneath her. Gray stood beside the window, peering through the narrow gap in the curtains and counting. 1 vehicle blocking the front corner of the building, 2 figures splitting off toward the rear entrance. At least 6 men, maybe 8. A pincer formation closing from both ends. Professional, not police. Police coming to make an arrest didn't drive with their headlights off from 2 blocks away. The elevator relay clicked as the car began rising from the ground floor. Someone had just called it up. "Backup route," Gray said. And no one asked which route because Jonah had already pulled the steel shelving unit in the kitchen away from the wall, revealing a narrow, hidden door leading into the building's utility corridor, something the organization had paid to create outside every official blueprint. They crawled through in exactly the order Gray indicated with 1 flick of his hand. Tessa first, Margot second, Jonah third. Gray last, pulling the heavy shelving back into place behind him. The utility corridor was dark and cramped, lined with exposed pipes running the length of the walls. They followed the faint glow of Margot's phone, half covered by her hand, descended a steep spiral iron staircase, and above them came the unmistakable sounds of the apartment door being forced open, followed by hurried footsteps spreading through the rooms, and an angry curse when someone discovered beds that were still warm while the people sleeping in them were gone. At the landing on the 2nd level of the maintenance stairs sat a ventilation hatch opening onto the roof of the adjoining parking structure. Jonah climbed out first, helped Tessa across, then Margot, and just as Gray stepped onto the dew-covered sheet metal roof below, the door at the bottom of the iron staircase burst open. A flashlight beam swept upward, and someone shouted with sudden excitement, "There they are. Run," Gray ordered, and they sprinted in crouched positions across the slick, sloping roof, while the footsteps chasing behind them hammered against the metal like hailstones. They reached the edge where the gap to the roof of the garage below measured little more than the length of one body. Jonah jumped first to become the landing point. Tessa shut her eyes and leaped, caught safely by his arms stretched wide like railroad tracks. Margot threw her backpack across before following. Gray paused for half a second at the roof's edge, turned around just as the first pursuer charged him, didn't step aside, but moved directly into the attack. Lowered one shoulder, used the man's own momentum to pull him across his hip, and slam his back into the sheet metal roof with one enormous hollow crash, before finally jumping down to rejoin his people. The sounds of the man scrambling back to his feet above, accompanied by the curses of his companions, told Gray they'd bought themselves about 15 seconds. 15 seconds were enough. At the far end of the garage roof stood an old rusted iron ladder leading into the alley below where dumpsters lined the walls, and parked there beneath a dusty gray tarp that made it look like an abandoned broken vehicle, waited the backup car Jonah had hidden there on the very first day, according to the emergency procedure he'd personally written years before. They ripped away the tarp, climbed inside, and Jonah allowed the car to roll silently the full length of the alley in neutral, before starting the engine and merging onto the boulevard exactly the way the manual prescribed, without one unnecessary flash of brake lights. No one spoke during the first 6 city blocks. Tessa sat in the back seat beside Margot, clutching the backpack containing the only thing that still mattered, her heartbeat still pounding somewhere high in her throat, and only after the city began thinning around them did she realize the silence inside the car wasn't the silence of people who'd narrowly escaped death. It was denser than that, heavier than that. Margot was the one who finally placed it on the table. Her voice remained as even as someone reading statistics, yet every word landed like stone. That apartment exists in no official records. No camera could have tracked our vehicle that day, because I personally verified the entire route. Every one of our phones is clean because I sweep them every day, which means nobody found that address through technology. That address left through someone's mouth, and only 4 people in this world knew it. All 4 are sitting in this car. Her words hung suspended above the sound of tires rolling across pavement. Tessa lowered her eyes to her own hands. She knew it wasn't her. But she also knew that to everyone else in the vehicle, she was still the stranger who'd arrived only 3 days earlier. Margot had already turned toward the side window after speaking, leaving the process of elimination to unfold inside everyone else's mind. And that process, whether anyone wanted it to or not, slowly drifted toward the driver's seat, toward the only man who knew every movement schedule and every security protocol of the group, the man who'd personally selected that apartment, personally hidden the backup car in the alley, the same man who'd leaned across the table only 2 nights earlier and asked his boss outright whether a waitress was really worth starting a war over. Jonah drove on with his eyes fixed straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. He was intelligent enough to know exactly what was unfolding inside the minds behind him, and proud enough not to offer a single word in his own defense. Gray sat in the front passenger seat without turning around. He merely lifted his eyes to the rearview mirror, and inside that small rectangle of glass, his gaze met the eyes of the brother who'd stood beside him for 15 years, who'd taken bullets for him both literally and figuratively. The 2 men looked at one another through the mirror for 3 seconds that felt as long as 3 winters. Neither blinked, neither spoke a word. Then Gray lowered his eyes back to the dark road ahead, and the entire car sank into a silence even harder to breathe than the ambush they'd just left behind. The new safe location was a converted warehouse on the west side of the city, and on their very first morning there, while the air remained thick with suspicion that no one had yet dared to name aloud, Margot placed a single name on the table, one she'd uncovered the previous night, while tracing Mercer's bribery payments. Because if you wanted to know what frightened a snake, all you had to do was follow the money it spent trying to avoid someone. Across 3 years of financial records, 2 investigations targeting Mercer's companies had briefly flared to life before quietly disappearing. Both had been smothered inside the county prosecutor's office, but one federal name appeared in the margins of both cases, untouched by a single dollar of Mercer's money, a special agent assigned to organized crime named Ruth Calder. 20 years on the job, financial records so clean they were almost boring. And judging from the trail of quiet document subpoenas her office had been sending out over the past 2 years, the woman had never abandoned her prey. She'd simply been waiting for something. Gray settled the approach with one rule that allowed no compromise. Neither he nor his organization could exist in any frame of this story. The person walking through a federal doorway had to be an ordinary citizen with a clean record, a civilian witness coming forward voluntarily. That meant Tessa, alone. After hearing the plan, she asked only one question. What if she's working for Mercer too? Gray answered with naked truth instead of reassurance. Then you'll be arrested under the warrant already hanging over your head. and we'll have to begin again from nothing. But if we stay where we are, every one of us runs out of road before Thursday morning. You're the only one who has the right to decide whether this gamble is worth taking." Tessa lowered her eyes to the pendant her mother had given her, the one she'd put back around her neck after escaping the restaurant, then looked up again and nodded. The meeting was arranged through a public payphone, and a password lifted directly from the case number of the very investigation that had once been buried. It took place at 4 o'clock that afternoon inside a modest diner in downtown Chicago, where Calder sat alone at the table in the far corner with a cup of black coffee and the eyes of someone who'd questioned more liars than she'd eaten breakfasts during her lifetime. Tessa sat across from her, placed a prepaid phone on the table, and spoke the opening sentence she'd rehearsed throughout the drive. "My name is Tessa Monroe. I'm being hunted for a crime I didn't commit, and I have 6 photographs taken from Boyd Mercer's private notebook." During the next 20 minutes, she told everything in the clear, organized sequence that only fear could forge. Calder listened without taking notes, without interrupting once. Only her eyes grew steadily sharper, like the lens of a camera, slowly finding perfect focus. Then Tessa mentioned the name crossed out in red ink inside the notebook, Manager Reyes, the man who'd disappeared and whom she believed had probably been murdered. The federal agent did something unexpected. She slowly lowered her coffee cup, looked at Tessa for another 3 seconds, then spoke in a voice noticeably quieter than before. "Emilio Reyes isn't dead, Miss Monroe." For a moment, Tessa thought she'd heard wrong. "He's alive. He's healthy. And he's bored out of his mind inside a house with nothing but cable television somewhere I can't tell you about," Calder continued. "He's been our confidential informant for 2 years. He came to us after discovering the numbers inside Ember Room didn't add up. The night the order came down to eliminate him, we pulled him into witness protection exactly 1 night beforehand. The red line you saw in that notebook wasn't the end of a man's life. It was an order that never had the chance to be carried out. To this day, Mercer still believes Reyes vanished because fear got the better of him." Tessa sat speechless, feeling as though the enormous stone crushing her chest since the previous week had suddenly been lifted halfway away. But Calder raised one finger, stopping that relief before it could settle. "Don't celebrate yet, because this is the irony I've had to swallow for 2 years. Reyes's testimony exposes the entire machine. But the testimony of one unhappy employee can't survive on its own in federal court without original evidence, and every document he ever saw remained inside the black notebook that never leaves Mercer's side. Twice we sought warrants based solely on his testimony. Twice the county prosecutors buried them through procedural objections. Now you understand why. What we've lacked for 2 years is a piece of that notebook itself, coming from an independent source, and you've just placed it on my coffee table." She leaned forward, laying out the legal battlefield in the calm voice of someone who'd already rehearsed it 1,000 times inside her own mind. "With Reyes's testimony combined with your 6 photographs, I have enough to persuade a federal judge to sign a sealed search warrant that will sit inside a safe targeting Mercer's office and his organization. But that sealed warrant can only be activated by one more thing: evidence of a crime actually taking place. Fresh, time-stamped, impossible to deny. Strong enough that no compromised prosecutor would dare bury it without setting himself on fire. In other words, Miss Monroe, we need Mercer to commit another crime this week, and we need someone to capture that moment in real time." The 2 women studied one another across the table before Calder finally asked the question Tessa had known would come sooner or later. The eyes, sharpened by 20 years of chasing organized crime, narrowed ever so slightly. "One more thing. Our internal reports mention an armed assault on a residential address early this morning. 8 professional attackers. And yet the intended target is sitting in front of me without so much as a scratch. You didn't escape that many armed men with nothing more than experience carrying serving trays, Miss Monroe. Who's standing behind you?" Tessa didn't blink. She didn't look away. She'd known exactly how she'd answer long before stepping into the diner. She spoke so calmly that even she surprised herself. "Someone my mother once fed." Ruth Calder studied the young waitress for a long time, weighing that answer with every measure 20 years of experience had given her. Then she did something neither procedure nor regulations could explain, but every hunter of dangerous prey understood on instinct. She nodded once, opened her notebook, and never asked that question again. "Then we have 3 days, she said. "Let's get to work." Gray never told anyone that he'd begun hunting the rat the moment the car pulled away from the alley after the ambush. He simply acted the way he always did, without declarations, without meetings. That morning, After Tessa left to meet Calder, he made 3 phone calls from 3 different numbers to 3 logistics coordinators within the organization, men who'd served him long enough to belong to the second circle of trust. Every call carried the exact same instruction: prepare a new safe place for an important guest. Absolute secrecy, but each man received a different address. A roadside motel on the north side, an apartment on the eastern boulevard, an abandoned printing shop near the river. 3 locations, 3 funnels. All they had to do was wait and see which funnel the water flowed out of. Margot placed untraceable rented electronic eyes around all 3 locations, and by 11 o'clock that night, one of her monitors lit up. A car without license plates slowly circled the abandoned printing shop near the river twice with its lights off, stopped for 3 minutes in a blind corner, then drove away. Margot turned the monitor toward Gray without saying a word. The printing shop was the address assigned to the Southern Logistics branch, and the Southern branch, Gray searched through the list in his head for less than 2 seconds, consisted of 4 people. 3 had served the organization for more than 10 years. The 4th was a 24-year-old driver named Cole Brennan, who'd joined only 11 months earlier. Quick, quiet, personally vouched for by Jonah Walsh because he'd known the boy's family back in the old neighborhood. And it was Cole, Gray suddenly remembered with a chill running down his spine, who'd driven the supplies that stocked the refrigerator inside the safe apartment 3 days earlier before the group had moved in. Cole hadn't been one of the 4 people who officially knew the address the way Margot had counted them. He'd existed outside the count, a shadow standing just beyond the edge of their calculation. One shadow that had almost hanged 15 years of brotherhood. Gray spoke only one sentence to Jonah: Cole Brennan, printing shop. Then he watched his second-in-command turn pale, before color flooded back into his face within the same breath. Jonah offered no defense for himself. He didn't plead for the young man either. He simply stood, put on his jacket, and said, "I'll bring him back here myself." At 1 o'clock in the morning, the warehouse door opened. Jonah stepped inside, pushing ahead of him a young man whose face had gone completely white, both wrists tied together with his own belt. Jonah forced him into the chair at the center of the room, then stepped aside with the posture of a soldier awaiting court-martial. Before Gray could ask a single question, Jonah spoke in the clipped voice of an official report. He confessed everything in the car. "I vouched for him, so that's my responsibility. However you judge him, judge me with him." Gray didn't even look at Jonah. He pulled over a chair, sat across from the trembling young man whose teeth chattered loudly enough to hear, and asked in the flat voice more frightening than any shout, "Why?" Cole Brennan swallowed twice before his voice finally came out. "My little brother. He owes one of Mercer's gambling operations $70,000. Last month they came right to my house. They showed me photographs of him standing outside his college campus. They told me all I had to do was answer a few questions about where one girl was staying. The debt would disappear. Otherwise, he never finished the sentence, and he didn't have to." Silence settled over the room. Margot stood against the wall with her arms folded. Jonah stared straight at the wall ahead, as though his own sentence had already been written across it. Tessa, who'd returned earlier that evening from meeting Calder, stood in the kitchen doorway and realized she was looking at another version of herself. Another ordinary human being, broken cleanly in half by debt. Everyone waited for the order that the underworld always reserved for traitors. But Gray sat there studying the young man for a long time, and inside his mind it wasn't the laws of organized crime that spoke. It was a comparison. A younger brother and a $70,000 debt, a mother and crushing hospital bills. Ordinary people transformed into tools by Boyd Mercer through exactly the same lever. Finally, Gray rose, walked over, personally removed the belt from around Cole Brennan's wrists, and spoke the sentence that stole the breath from everyone in the room. The kind of debt that makes a man betray. "I understand debt better than you think." Then he turned the chair back around, sat once more, and his voice became cold steel, shaped for work. "But listen carefully. From this moment on, your life belongs to your silence. What happened tonight never leaves this room. As far as Mercer is concerned, you've never been exposed. You're still his loyal little rat. You'll still answer his calls. You'll still report to him. There's only one difference. From now on, every piece of information you give him will be written by me. Do you understand what I'm giving you? Not forgiveness. A chance to repay your debt, your brother's debt, and your debt to me, by turning the tongue that betrayed me into the knife pressed against Mercer's throat. Cole Brennan stared at the man before him, as though looking at a species he'd never known existed, then nodded so hard it seemed his neck might snap. Gray gave one final order using 3 names. Only I, Jonah, and Margot know about this, not a 4th person inside the organization. Then he turned toward the city map spread across the table where the Halstead property, the abandoned Calumet steel mill, and Mercer's office building had each been circled in heavy ink. The rest of the night passed with 4 heads bent together beneath the dim lamp, as 2 separate lines of attack were refined down to every final detail. The first required bait irresistible enough to draw Mercer's forces to the wrong place. The second required that bait to speak one precise sentence at one precise moment, while the entire city was watching him. And when Gray underlined the word Calumet, then slowly lifted his eyes, Margot saw in them the unmistakable light of a man who'd already seen the checkmate several moves ahead. On Wednesday night, the final night before groundbreaking day, Cole Brennan sat inside his car in the parking lot of a closed supermarket, holding the prepaid phone Mercer's people had given him, and spoke into it word for word from a voice message he'd rehearsed 3 times under Margot's watchful eye, letting just the right amount of fear shake his voice. The waitress is hiding at the old Calumet steel mill on the south side. I overheard them talking. Tomorrow morning they're taking her to meet someone from the federal government with the original evidence. Tonight is the last night she'll still be there. The message was sent at 9 o'clock that evening, and 40 minutes later Margot's screen showed exactly what she'd been waiting for. Communications throughout Mercer's network suddenly buzzed like a beehive struck with a stick. The fish had smelled the bait, and it was every bit as hungry as Gray had predicted because, to Mercer, only 12 hours remained before the crowning moment of his life, and every threat had to be ripped out by the roots before sunrise. At midnight, Gray entered the Calumet steel mill alone. He knew every passage through that enormous steel skeleton from the years in his early 20s, when he'd worked under Patrick Doyle, the man who'd ruled before him and had once used the place as a warehouse. 15 years of abandonment hadn't changed the bones of the building. They'd only covered its memories with rust. He walked the entire structure the way a stage manager inspected a theater before opening night. 3 main staircases, 2 secondary ones, the towering blast furnaces, the rolling mill where silent steel rollers lay like the bones of ancient beasts, the underground slag tunnel running from the furnace foundations to the scrapyard beyond the western fence. Then, on the 2nd floor of the old office wing, he positioned a small flashlight, so its beam slipped through a crack in a boarded window, just bright enough for anyone watching from outside to believe someone inside was desperately trying not to be seen. After that, he chose his position, extinguished every remaining source of light on his body, and waited. At 17 minutes past 4 in the morning, 3 vehicles rolled silently through the service road toward the southern gate with their headlights off, and 8 figures spread out in 2 converging teams around the main building, moving efficiently, communicating with hand signals, carrying themselves exactly like professionals paid to perform this kind of work. Gray watched from a 3rd-floor window, counting them, memorizing how they divided themselves. 2 men remained outside securing the perimeter. 6 entered the building. He let them come. Tonight's plan wasn't to defend the doors. Tonight's plan was a performance that required the audience to occupy exactly the right seats. The 6 men had barely reached the blast furnace hall before the darkness itself began working for its master. Gray dropped a rusted bolt onto the steel floor on the eastern side. The piece of metal bounced, rolled, and echoed through 3 stories of empty space, and the 6-man formation immediately split in half on pure professional instinct. 3 turned toward the sound. 3 continued toward the main staircase, exactly as he'd intended. A school of fish, divided by an invisible current. He dealt with the eastern team first, 1 man at a time, using the method Doyle had called setting the table without spilling a glass. The first man became separated from the other 2 by a narrow corridor running between massive storage tanks. As soon as he slipped into the darkness, 1 arm locked around his shoulders from behind, twisted, compressed, and the man went limp in complete silence before he even understood that the darkness itself had moved. When he eventually woke, he'd find himself neatly tied behind one of the steel tanks with duct tape across his mouth, uninjured except for his professional pride. The second man heard the faint disturbance from the next section and stepped inside to investigate. The steel platform beneath his feet, the very panel Gray had loosened by removing 4 bolts shortly after midnight, tilted just enough to throw him off balance for a single heartbeat. 1 heartbeat was all the owner of the building needed to emerge from behind the support column. 20 seconds later, the second man sat beside the first, tied with exactly the same knot. The third man proved more careful. He stopped in the middle of the passage, quietly called the names of his two partners, then slowly backed toward the staircase when no answer came. Gray had to follow him through 2 floors before finally waiting until they reached the corner where the handrail had broken away years ago. Only there did he close the hold around the man's body in a brief struggle that sent both of them crashing into the railing. And that impact awakened Gray's oldest enemy, the left knee Doyle's world had shattered years before. A sharp spear of pain shot upward through his hip, forcing him to lean against the wall for 5 full seconds, breathing through clenched teeth while his body reminded him he was 34 years old now, not 24, before bending down to tie up the third man. The phone inside his jacket vibrated once without making a sound. Margot's message appeared on the screen, hidden inside his palm. "Second team in position. The package has been delivered to the office. Waiting for your signal." Gray replied with a single character before putting the phone away because down below in the blast furnace hall, events had finally reached the stage he'd been waiting for all night. The remaining 3 men from the entry team had regrouped at the foot of the main staircase, and they were no longer moving. They stood back to back in a triangle, weapons covering 3 different directions, and through the gap in the second-floor grating, Gray watched the team leader, a heavily built man wearing an earpiece, do exactly what the entire performance had been designed to force him to do. He stopped searching, raised a hand to the radio clipped to his shoulder, and began calling back for instructions. What Mercer's 8 gunmen didn't know, and what Boyd Mercer himself didn't know, was that the private, encrypted radio channel he'd trusted as completely as he trusted his own safe had stopped belonging solely to him 2 days earlier, when Margot traced the equipment batch number hidden inside one of the purchasing entries in those 6 pages of the black notebook, and from there unlocked the frequency the way someone opened a door with a key that had already been cut. So at 5 minutes past 5 that morning, when the broad-shouldered team leader stood back-to-back with his 2 remaining men at the foot of the main staircase and pressed the radio button, his voice didn't travel only to Boyd Mercer's office. It flowed simultaneously into a recording system inside the warehouse on the west side of the city, where Margot sat before her bank of equipment with headphones covering her ears while Tessa stood behind her, her hands clasped so tightly they hurt, listening to every word through the speaker. The team leader reported in the restrained language of a professional mercenary. "Target not located. 3 of my men have gone silent on the eastern side. Something's wrong with this building. Request instructions." The other end remained silent for several seconds before Mercer's voice came through, crisp and cold. "Keep searching. The building only contains 1 waitress. There are 8 armed men on your team. Don't make me remind you what I'm paying you for." The transmission ended. On the second floor, hidden behind the steel grating, Gray heard the entire exchange through the earpiece connected to Margot's system, and he knew it wasn't enough. An order to continue searching wouldn't nail anyone to the wall. He needed Mercer to speak the words buried at the bottom of his tongue, and to do that he had to tighten the screw another 2 turns at exactly the moment when the clock was working in his favor. He checked his watch. It was almost 6 o'clock. The groundbreaking ceremony would begin at 7:30, which meant that inside Mercer's mind every passing minute was another step toward the biggest stage of his entire life. The caution of the fox was being worn away minute by minute by the fever of a man about to be crowned, and Gray decided to let that fever burn even hotter. He moved, not to disappear, but to be seen. A brief shadow slipped across the top of the second-floor staircase, slow enough for the 3 men below to catch sight of it, fast enough that none of them could react. Then his footsteps deliberately pounded across the steel floor toward the western office wing, where the flashlight still shone through the crack in the boarded window, and the 3 mercenaries took the bait exactly as instinct demanded. They stormed up to the second floor, kicked open the office door, and found nothing except a flashlight resting on a desk, aimed at an empty chair, and a woman's coat, bought from a second-hand store, casually draped across its back. The team leader stood in the middle of that empty room, realizing he'd been led by the nose through a maze while his numbers kept shrinking, and he did the only thing a professional hired gun could do when the mission slipped beyond his control while the clock kept running out. He pressed the radio button again, and this time every trace of restraint vanished from his voice. "Sir, we've got a problem. This is a trap. I've lost 5 men. I repeat, 5 men. There's someone else inside this building. A professional. I need verbal orders right now. Do we pull out or stay? And if we find the girl, how far do you want this taken? I need every word clearly, because I'm not carrying this alone." On the other end of the transmission, inside the dressing room behind the ceremony stage, erected on the Halstead property. Boyd Mercer stood before a mirror with his tie only half finished. Through the opening in the curtain, he could already see the guest seating filling up while the television crews raised their transmission towers. In 30 minutes, he'd be standing beside the mayor before cameras broadcasting to the entire city. And in that single moment, trapped between the greatest stage of his life and the news that 5 gunmen had vanished, the most cautious man in Chicago committed the first and last mistake of his life. He pressed the button and spoke each word slowly and clearly into the radio. Listen carefully. I don't care what's inside that building. There are still 3 of you left, and you have one job. That girl doesn't leave that place. Am I clear? She does not leave under her own power. Handle her the same way you handled Reyes. When it's finished, burn the whole place, double the payment, and don't call me again. Inside the warehouse on the west side, Margot shot upright in her chair. Her hands flew across the keyboard while her lips silently counted everything she was packaging. Original transmission, server timestamp, voice spectrum matching Boyd Mercer's publicly available interviews from 3 television appearances. Everything compressed into a digitally sealed evidence package and transmitted directly to the address Special Agent Ruth Calder had provided through the secure channel, accompanied by the exact sentence Tessa dictated for Margot to type. Crime in progress. Real-time evidence. Request activation. On the opposite side of the city, inside an unmarked government vehicle parked 3 blocks from the ceremony stage, Calder listened to the complete recording once without blinking, then picked up her phone and called the private number of the federal judge who'd already signed the sealed warrant. The conversation lasted 4 minutes before ending with the sentence she'd spent 2 years waiting to hear. Warrant activated. Execute immediately this morning. Back at Calumet, Gray removed the earpiece and allowed himself exactly 1 long breath before leaving his position because his role on this stage had come to its end. The remaining 3 gunmen could spend another hour searching that empty labyrinth if they wished. He made his way down beside the blast furnace using a route only he remembered, crouched into the pitch-black slag tunnel running beneath the factory floor. His left knee protested every step with sharp stabs of pain, but he kept moving, one hand sliding along smoke-stained brick walls from an era whose fires had long since gone cold, until he emerged among the scrapyard, beyond the western fence, just as daylight fully broke. He crossed through mountains of twisted steel toward the car hidden behind an abandoned freight car, started the engine, and rolled smoothly onto the service road, while the 2 men guarding the outer perimeter remained staring at the southern entrance, waiting for prey that would never emerge from that direction. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:45. 90 minutes remained until the final moves of the game, and the car turned toward Halstead. At 7:30 on Thursday morning, the first golden light of day spread across the vacant ground where the old Halstead block had once stood, a place where a white ceremony stage now rose among rows of guest seating, company-colored balloons, and a massive backdrop, displaying the glittering future development so grand that it covered every memory of the homes that had once stood there. Television crews had already raised their broadcast towers for the live coverage. Reporters lined the temporary barriers. The mayor arrived at 20 minutes before 8 to applause, and Boyd Mercer stepped onto the stage wearing a light gray suit pressed so perfectly that every seam looked untouched by human hands, his face bright and composed, without the slightest trace of the radio call from 2 hours earlier, because men like him lived 2 separate lives and never allowed them to touch. He spoke into the forest of microphones with the warm voice the entire city had grown accustomed to hearing in charity advertisements. He spoke about his own humble childhood. He spoke about his dream of bringing jobs and housing back to the South Side. Then he delivered the sentence that would later be replayed over and over by every news station like fate carving its own scar. This land once fed honest people, and today we repay it with a future worthy of their memory. He lowered his head modestly as applause swept across the crowd, and no one seated among the invited guests noticed the 4 dark vehicles that quietly rolled to a stop along the edge of the property, without sirens or flashing lights. Ruth Calder stepped out first, wearing a dark blue windbreaker with 3 gold letters across the back. 8 federal agents followed behind her in 2 disciplined lines, walking without hurry yet with the unstoppable certainty of people carrying lawful authority. The reporters noticed them even before the event security team did. Every camera that had been pointed toward the stage swung around at once like a flock of birds changing direction in the sky. Calder walked straight up the center aisle between the rows of chairs and climbed onto the stage just as Mercer lifted the gold-plated ceremonial shovel, preparing for the symbolic first scoop of earth. She didn't raise her voice, but the microphones on the podium captured every word and carried them live across 3 television networks. Boyd Mercer, I am Special Agent Ruth Calder of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are under arrest for directing the attempted murder of a witness, money laundering, human trafficking, and other federal crimes. You have the right to remain silent. For 1 second. Exactly 1 second. The mask of the respectable businessman slipped from Mercer's face, and beneath it the entire city saw through their television screens something cold and empty that had no name. Then he smiled, calmly turned toward the mayor, who stood frozen beside him, and said, "This must certainly be some misunderstanding." "My attorney will," Calder cut him off in the same even voice with which someone read an official record. "The misunderstanding carries a timestamp of 5:37 this morning, sir. We have your voice, every single word of it." Mercer stopped. And in that instant, everyone watching saw understanding strike him all at once, not gradually, but like a building collapsing after explosives detonated at its foundation. The dawn radio transmission, the verbal order he'd spoken slowly and clearly, because he wanted his men to hear every word. Handle her the same way you handled Reyes. Yet he still didn't know the rest. He didn't know that at that very moment, across the city, a second federal team was executing the sealed search warrant at his office, opening the safe and lifting out the black notebook he'd believed was more secure than his own life. He didn't know that at the harbor, the Coast Guard working alongside customs officers had just intercepted a cargo vessel and opened shipping containers whose paperwork identified them as agricultural machinery. He didn't know that thick investigative files had already been sitting on the desks of 4 newspaper editors since midnight, with instructions to publish immediately if news of his arrest failed to appear that morning. One final safeguard ensuring that not a single corrupt hand inside the system would dare suppress the story. 2 federal agents stepped forward, and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs closing around Boyd Mercer's wrists echoed cleanly through the microphones, broadcasting live into living rooms throughout the city. He was escorted down the steps of the stage between rows of stunned guests, past the backdrop displaying the glass tower that would never be built, past the gold-plated shovel someone had dropped onto the red carpet, while his polished leather shoes walked across the very soil of the Halstead block. The land he'd spent 3 years and destroyed countless lives to steal, the same ground that now became the place where the entire city watched him fall. And from beginning to end, exactly as one man had quietly predicted inside a safe apartment 4 days earlier, not a single bullet had needed to be fired. Behind the media barrier, standing among curious bystanders who'd stopped to watch, a young woman wearing a baseball cap remained as still as stone, watching the handcuffed man pass less than 10 steps away from her. The man who'd hunted her mother's debt the way hunters tracked prey, who'd turned the final 3 years of a kind woman's life into sleepless nights buried beneath impossible numbers, who'd nearly buried Tessa herself beneath the concrete foundations of that grand dream. Tessa Monroe didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't rush toward him. She simply lifted her right hand to the small pendant resting against her collarbone, closed her fingers around it, the way someone held the hand of a loved one during life's most important moments, and whispered with lips that barely moved at all, "Mom, do you see this?" 3 blocks away, inside a car hidden behind a line of trees, Grayson Donovan watched the entire scene unfold through the live broadcast on his phone. Not a single expression crossed his face. Only his thumb slowly brushed once across the worn face of the old watch strapped to his left wrist. Very slowly. Then he put the phone away, started the engine, and drove off before the handcuffs had even disappeared behind the doors of the federal vehicle, because there was still one debt left unpaid in this story, and it wasn't written anywhere inside the records of any court. The following night, while the city was still buzzing with news of the most shocking arrest it had seen in years, Gray knocked on Tessa's door at the warehouse on the west side and said in his usual voice that never wasted explanations, "Come with me. There's somewhere I want you to see." She didn't ask where. After everything they'd been through, she'd learned that this man never spoke an unnecessary word. The car rolled through the city night, past brightly lit streets, then turned toward the south side, slowed, and stopped at a street corner that Tessa's heart recognized before her eyes did. Halstead, 2 blocks from the groundbreaking site, where the construction fencing hadn't yet reached, an old row of boarded storefronts still stood. In the middle of them, beneath the dim yellow glow of a streetlight, a narrow doorway remained, its weathered wooden sign hanging crookedly from 2 rusted iron hooks. The color had almost completely faded, but if someone stared long enough and closely enough, traces of the old blue paint could still be seen. Tessa stepped out of the car and stood silently on the sidewalk. She hadn't returned here since the day she'd signed the transfer papers. She'd never found the courage. She couldn't understand how Gray knew this place, or why he'd brought her here tonight, until she turned and saw the most powerful man on the south side staring at that weathered sign with the eyes of someone standing before a Patacation, sacred temple. "It's been 18 years since I stood on this corner," he said, his voice so low it sounded as though he were speaking to the sign itself instead of to her. 18 years. Every time I had business in this neighborhood, I told my driver to take another route. I told myself it was to save time. But people don't spend 18 years driving around a place just to save time. They drive around because there are places they can't bear to face. He fell silent for a while, and Tessa didn't rush him. She felt herself standing at the edge of something immense that was slowly opening before her. "When I was 16, Gray said, I had no one. No family, no home, no name worth remembering. All of that happened too long ago, and none of it matters anymore. What matters is one winter evening. I was standing at the end of the alley behind these buildings when a back door opened. Warm kitchen light poured out like honey, and a woman stood there wiping her hands on her apron. She saw me and didn't ask a single question. Not my name, not my age, not why I was there. She simply went back inside and came out again, carrying a bowl of hot chicken soup. She set it on the step beside me with a slice of bread, then sat down one arm's length away. She didn't watch me eat because she didn't want to embarrass me. She just looked out toward the alley. When I'd finished the best bowl of soup I'd ever eaten in my life, I mumbled that I had nothing to give her in return. She waved her hand as though I'd said something ridiculous. Then she said, "People don't owe each other food, son. People owe each other kindness." Tessa lifted a hand to cover her mouth. "That entire winter," Gray continued, never taking his eyes from the sign, "I came back to those steps every night. Every night there was another bowl of hot soup waiting for me. Not one question. Then spring came. Someone found me and led me onto the road that eventually turned me into the man I became. I left this neighborhood and never came back. I never even learned her name. To the boy I was back then, she was simply the woman with the bowl of soup and the blue-painted sign. But her words stayed with me for 18 years, through everything I'd done and everything I'd become. They remained there like a seed buried beneath concrete." He turned toward her, and beneath the streetlight, Tessa saw something on that famously expressionless face that no one in the city had ever witnessed. "The night you made soup in that kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning," he said. "I smelled it, and 18 years collapsed in a single second. Then you told me about the blue sign, about the Halsted corner, about the one-bowl rule, and you repeated those exact words, every single one, in exactly the same rhythm I'd heard beside those steps on that winter night. But I wouldn't let myself believe it. I kept telling myself it had to be coincidence, because if it was true, then the woman who'd saved my life was the very woman Boyd Mercer destroyed, and her daughter was standing right in front of me being hunted while I almost stopped to weigh costs and consequences like nothing more than another businessman, instead of simply doing what was right." He raised his left wrist, removed the old watch the entire underworld had always whispered about, wondering why a crime boss wore something so cheap, turned it over, and carefully pried open the metal back with his thumbnail. Hidden beneath the cover, neatly folded and pressed flat through 18 years, lay a yellowed paper napkin with faded printing, a tiny drawing of the sign, and a few worn words. "June's, Halsted Corner. The best chicken soup on the south side. She wrapped my bread in this napkin on the last night I ever saw her," Gray said softly. "It's the only thing I kept from my old life. I bought this cheap watch for one reason only, to have somewhere to hide it. I've worn it every day for all these years, without ever finding the courage to come back and read the restaurant's name from the real sign." He placed the yellowed napkin into Tessa's open palm, gently folded her fingers around it, and finally spoke the words he'd owed her ever since the night she'd knelt to pick up the fallen towel beside the dinner table. "I didn't save you because you begged me, Tessa. People beg me every day. I saved you because 18 years ago your mother saved me first, and she never even knew my name." Tessa stood on the Halsted sidewalk holding her mother's paper napkin inside her hand, and she cried. For the first time since this story had begun, she allowed herself to cry without restraint. Not because she was afraid, not because she was hurting, but because of something greater than every sorrow she'd ever known. Her mother's bowls of soup had never disappeared. They'd simply traveled very far. They'd journeyed through 18 long years. They'd passed through the darkest life in the entire city until, On the most desperate night of Tessa's own life, her mother's kindness had finally found its way home, risen out of the memory of a stranger, and come back to save her daughter. 3 months later, spring settled over Chicago's South Side, and the city had already witnessed what legal experts would later call the domino effect. Boyd Mercer's network collapsed from within, exactly the way every empire built on fear eventually does. Once its head sat behind the bars of a federal prison, loyalty revealed itself to be nothing more than an investment. One by one, the officers from Precinct 9, the senior assistant inside the district attorney's office, the executives who'd managed the shell companies, all lined up to cooperate with Special Agent Calder in exchange for lighter sentences. Every new statement unlocked another door, and the case file grew thicker week after week, like a book writing itself. Even Mercer's final move betrayed him. The fabricated dossier meant to destroy the Donovan organization, the one he'd trusted as his dead man's switch, was discovered during the federal search. Experts proved it had been forged from the seals to the signatures, and instead of dragging anyone else down with him, it became yet another charge of manufacturing false evidence in the ever-growing indictment against him. On the corner of Halstead, where the unfinished project's construction fences had been removed after the city reclaimed the land, something far smaller than any headline, yet warmer than all of them combined, quietly came back to life. June's reopened. The transfer documents signed years before were declared void because they'd been created through financial coercion. The crushing hospital debt was erased as part of the court-ordered compensation for the victims. And on an April morning, Tessa Monroe stood once again inside her mother's old kitchen, tied on her apron, lit the stove, and placed the first pot of soup over the flame after all those years. The wooden sign was painted once more in exactly the same shade of blue it had worn long ago. She painted it herself, just as her mother once had. At the back door of the restaurant, she built a small wooden shelf with a handwritten message. "If you're hungry, knock on the door. 1 bowl of hot soup. No names required." June Monroe's 1-bowl rule lived on because some legacies aren't written into wills. They're carried forward by the way the people left behind choose to live. Old neighbors gradually returned. People told one another the story of the young restaurant owner who'd brought down a crime boss. But Tessa only smiled and served another bowl of soup because she understood that she hadn't defeated Mercer. He'd been brought down by a long line of decent people who'd each stood exactly where they were meant to stand. Reyes had dared to tell the truth. Calder had refused to give up after 2 years, and one man who never accepted credit for anything. That man, the city slowly began to realize, was changing too, though in his own quiet way. The darkest gambling dens on the South Side quietly closed their doors. Outstanding loans were settled with their interest reduced to nothing. Members of his organization gradually moved into legitimate security, transportation, and construction companies with proper licenses. No announcements were made. There were no dramatic press conferences about redemption, because Grayson Donovan didn't believe 15 years could be redeemed in a single night. He believed only in what he'd told Jonah one late evening, while standing beside the city map, that a man whose life had once been saved by a bowl of soup had no right to spend the rest of his life pretending kindness didn't exist, and that at 34 years old, he was finally old enough to understand he could never repair the past, yet still young enough to choose the road he wanted to walk through the years he had left. On the day June's welcomed customers once again, a package arrived without a card. Inside was a framed photograph. When Tessa peeled away the wrapping paper, she stood silently in the middle of the restaurant for a very long time. It was a black and white enlargement, taken from the archives of the local newspaper, originally published in a small feature about family restaurants 18 years earlier. At the center of the photograph stood her mother, June Monroe, younger than in any picture Tessa still owned, smiling in front of the restaurant while wearing her apron, every line of that smile exactly as Tessa remembered it. And in the far right corner of the photograph, faint but unmistakable to anyone who looked carefully, sitting on the shaded back steps with his head lowered over a steaming bowl of soup, was a thin teenage boy. Tessa hung the photograph on the main wall of the restaurant without a caption, and without telling anyone its story. Every day customers ate their soup beneath that picture, without ever realizing they were sitting between the two ends of an extraordinary circle that had taken 18 years to complete. And every Saturday afternoon, when sunlight slanted through the freshly cleaned front windows, a man wearing an ordinary jacket walked through the door without bodyguards, without expensive cars parked outside, sat down at the wooden table in the corner like the most ordinary, regular customer in the world, and the owner never needed to ask what he wanted. A few minutes later, she always placed before him a bowl of hot chicken soup made from the same old recipe: fragrant sautéed onions, thick slices of carrot, crushed black pepper, and one ingredient that had never appeared in the recipe itself: a smile. The man always thanked her in his deep, quiet voice, then slowly ate every spoonful while sitting perfectly straight, never leaving behind a single drop, as though performing a ritual he'd vowed to continue for the rest of his life. Their story would continue far beyond this day, but its lesson had already reached its perfect ending. Kindness never disappears. It simply travels in circles. Sometimes those circles are very long, passing through many years and countless shadows, but somehow kindness always finds its way home. A single bowl of soup given to the right person at exactly the right moment can save 2 lives separated by 18 years. So never underestimate one small act of kindness, because you never know where the seed you plant today will bloom in someone else's future. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so together we can spread more kindness, and make sure you never miss another inspiring story. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Which moment moved you the most? Please leave a comment below, because your heartfelt words mean more to us than you know. They inspire us to keep bringing you even more meaningful stories. Thank you sincerely for staying with us until the very last moment of today's story. We wish you and your family wonderful health, lasting happiness, peaceful days, and a life filled with comfort and joy. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.